Welcome to White Rabbit Podcast, a Thelema broadcast, a podcast dedicated to discussions on life from the perspective of those who accept the law of Thelema. My name is Gwen Gunther, and I am your podcast hostess today. Joining me is internationally known author, artist, and speaker, J. Daniel Gunther. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
In our last podcast that we did, you recall, we had a private discussion between friends, basically talking about how we discovered Thelema through the written word.
Right.
The reason I mention that is because my hope is in this podcast to pick up that discussion, but from a historical and academic point of view.
Very well.
I would like to introduce our special guest today, fellow Thelemite from Portland, Oregon, Keith Readdy. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Well, I introduced Keith from Portland, Oregon, as being from Portland, Oregon. However, you recently just moved there. Is that correct?
That is correct. About a year ago or so.
About a year ago. And you moved there from Amsterdam?
Yes, I was in Amsterdam for, I'd say a couple years.
Couple years. So, while you were in Amsterdam, you were studying at the University of Amsterdam's Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents?
Yes.
Why don't you tell me what your master's degree was in?
Well, I studied theology and religious studies. That's my technical diploma. I was in there for a couple years and focused in the program on Western esotericism, which is, believe it or not, actually a more recently emerging field, subfield of religious studies that focuses on all the esoteric currents of religion. And my particular focus was centered on late modern and contemporary period.
I have here your thesis titled The Style of a Letter, the Thelemic Movement and its Culture of Publication. So why did you choose this subject?
Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, when studying the history of religion, there's a handful of subjects that we can have a scholarly analysis. And with regard to publication in particular, publication is something that we have historical records of. So it really helped as a tool, a motivating force to be able to study a particular religious movement or a spiritual movement or any particular historical movement through these documents that we have, these historical documents. I found a lot of inspiration to study the Thelemic movement, particularly because it's always been a literature-driven type of movement, and the fact that it's a contemporary movement really provided a lot of opportunity to engage in an academic study of that through material religion such as publication.
Can you give us an overview of your thesis? I know that's a big question, but maybe some general points that were important to you, marking the history of the evolvement of Thelema.
Sure. Well, many people have seen lots of biographies on Aleister Crowley emerge, and there's been some not so good ones. There's been recently some well-done material. And there's been very little actual scholarly work on the movement that he promoted in his lifetime, known as Thelema. Very little work has been done after his lifetime. So I was very interested to sort of produce something. And I found some opportunity. I came across a lot of resources to be able to engage in that and to bring it out into a broader perspective of what this meant, not only for the Thelemic movement and its historical development, but also the historical development of how a spiritual movement in contemporary society develops, and what factors are involved with that, what sorts of constraints there are with greater cultural and social factors. And Thelema just happened to be a great case study for looking at that.
Based on your thesis, what is the significance of publication in general for religion? Basically, based on how publication has been influential in religious movements in the Western world.
Well, publication's been so important for culture and history, even before the printing press. Something I sort of mentioned in the introduction is that before anything was ever written down, a lot of tradition was based in oral tradition, so things handed down from culture to culture, from generation to generation within a specific culture. As doctrinal materials started being developed early on, let's say, for instance, in Christianity, authoritative figures within this got together and decided what was going to be agreed upon and where scripture was going to be developed. So even in the early days, before there was even real publication, written word became significant. Now, if we fast forward and we get more into the Renaissance period and just after, when the printing press was developed, roughly right after 1500 or so, this became an explosive invention for history and culture in the Western world, because now things could be mass-produced and distributed. And for instance, from an esoteric perspective, one example of this is the early 17th century manuscripts called the Rosicrucian manuscripts. And these were disseminated, widespread throughout Europe, and by the 1700s, it just creates this intense furor of esoteric religious activity and a whole speculative movement of Rosicrucianism. And then later on, this stuff kind of gets implemented into initiatory societies into the early and late modern periods. So you can kind of see its importance with how things sort of become developed and ideas become implemented, and how important that is for any particular movement, whether it's an exoteric doctrine or any particular esoteric movement, for instance, in the modern period.
Yeah, I think movement is the key word, because from what you're saying, this ability to publish written word establishes the dogma and the structure of what the movement is trying to say, and it removes the limitations of small structures or small cultish circles, and just explodes to where a wide range of culturally diverse people can also read and study the same thing. One thing Crowley did was really write a lot and really publish
Highly
a whole
prolific,
lot.
yes.
Yeah, highly. I mean, he used used a great deal of his own personal finances also to make that happen. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could give an explanation of Crowley's motivation to publish Thelema based on some of the stuff you wrote in your thesis.
Well, for those people out there that don't know all the intricate details of the Thelemic movement and its history, and when I say Thelemic movement, I mean those associated with Crowley's writings, the stuff that developed into the AA movement that he put forth, and then later, of course, the OTO development later on. So this is kind of what I mean generally by the Thelemic movement. But early on, there wasn't social gatherings associated with this. You know, this is a later development in the Ordo Templi Orientis. This is much later than when he was really starting out his magical career. And what happens is he wants to build off of, the spiritual teachings of the Golden Dawn, which in his experience had fallen into schism, and he attributed that to spiritual teachings being mixed with social gatherings. So after this, he was highly reluctant for serious seekers on the path to intermingle in large groups. So when he started rebuilding this teaching system, this series of testing, which later became the teachings in the AA, he decided that only a student along the path would have an instructor, and then later on a student, and would only be interacting with these, so it would not corrupt the teachings by being involved with groups. But the problem with this is he understood that by keeping this a severely intact and restrained way of doing this, it was very hard to promote on a social level, and that's where publication came in for Crowley. And he knew this, and the best way that he could use a mouthpiece to let the world know that these teachings were available to any who would want to aspire was through, the periodical that he put out called The Equinox in 1909, until I think about 1913 or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
1913.
So, and he often put these out at cost out of his own pocket. He would not charge people an arm and a leg for these. He would charge them at the cost that they were to be produced, because he wanted to let people know that there were teachings out there at no cost, so that a serious student would also be able to attain through these spiritual teachings. And he was later highly prolific. He just had so much literature, and there's still to this day stuff that lies in his literary legacy that has yet to be published.
In chapter 3 of your thesis, titled From Ashes to Flame, I'd like to read a bit of that to bring us into the next subject matter. You say, in chapter 1, a brief historical account of Thelema was given. It was seen how the movement, as represented by any one collective group of people, dwindled after the death of its founder, Aleister Crowley. And that brings us, like I said, to the next subject. We would like to talk about the events that followed after Aleister Crowley's death, and in particular to the written publications and the written word, and some of the main historical landmarks.
Sure.
I know you did an in-depth historical analysis of that.
Well, yeah, as I previously mentioned, a lot of my thesis focused not necessarily on Crowley's life and his published life, but what followed, because it ends up being a very rocky history to the point where we didn't even know if it would have survived, after his death. And this is mainly due to a lot of the discrepancies that surrounded a lot of his literary legacy. When he died in 1947, Lewis Wilkinson and John Symonds became his literary executors. So anything within the continent of England, it was up to them legally to be able to decide if they wanted it published or not. Now, he had a former student as well that was charged with, by the name of Gerald York, who was charged with getting his remaining literary remains and consolidating them with Crowley's named successor at the time, Carl Johannes Germer. And these two men went at great lengths to send one another manuscripts of Crowley's works back and forth and get them consolidated. Germer kept some where he was living in the United States, and Gerald York put these together in an archival microfilm that's now held at the Gerald York Collection in the Warburg Institute in London. But after this, the only real activity as far as the OTO was going after Crowley's death was in California and Agape Lodge, which was already starting to kind of fall apart at this point. And Carl Germer seemed to have been mostly concerned with securing all the literary rights and everything. So as activity started to dwindle at Agape Lodge, Carl Germer was growing pretty old by that point, and he was successful in getting the literature put together, but as far as social movements and everything really kind of dwindled at that point, and then from there's a whole story about how revival and everything kind of happens, after Germer.
Let me quote page 26 of your thesis. Social space, post-war, and the counterculture. Although the Thelemic revival can be traced through its history of published material, this material came into existence because of very specific historical conditions at the time. It has been discussed that Carl Germer was less concerned with continuing the OTO than he was with securing the literary remains of Aleister Crowley. He died in 1962 without formally naming a successor, placing the Thelemic movement into a period of interregnum. It can be assumed that Germer's further isolation from the remaining Thelemites until his death resulted from the paranoid disposition he developed after being imprisoned in a Nazi internment camp, followed by an investigation by the FBI on his arrival in the United States. However, Germer died in 1962 at a culturally pivotal period of time when the phenomenon known as the counterculture was growing. The social space that was created by the counterculture throughout the decade of the 1960s in North America laid fertile ground for the Thelemic movement to take root.
Well, a couple things first. What I mean by social space, this is a methodology I employed in my thesis called spatial analysis. It's a way of looking at how a certain type of space is created to analyze this material, this data that we have. And how I divided this up was looking at social factors, geographical factors, so physical space, social space, cultural spaces, to explain kind of what's going on here. Now, the excerpt you just quoted mentioned interregnum, and what this is a period of lull that happens in the history. So after Germer dies in 1962, we have to think about what's going on in the last years of Germer's life. As was mentioned there, he experienced not one, but I think 2 or 3 times in an internment camp during the Nazi regime, which was an atrocious experience. There's letters where he talks about this, and he survived it. But then what happens is he moves to the United States, and this is in a period when the Red Scare happens in the United States. So these cultural factors that are kind of impinging on what happens for Germer gives him a great deal of reluctance to be involved on a very social level, I think. And much of his letter correspondences kind of seem to imply that he wants to maintain the relationships that he has with people. But he's really more interested in securing the literary remains at this point. He was even investigated by the FBI, for his association with Aleister Crowley in the 1940s, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a kind of an oppressive cultural environment of McCarthyism and all of this stuff happening in the late 40s and 50s that I consider might have contributed to a lull or inactivity that kind of happens with Thelema and maybe even esoteric movements in general. But he dies in 1962, having successfully gathered this material, and before he dies, he moves out to California. So all of this literature, all of these literary remains of Crowley are stuffed away in his house when he dies, and in his will he leaves it to the heads of the order, he calls it, which is a very vague statement. I think he's implying the OTO at this point. But at that point, there are no real heads of the order. They're scattered across the world. There's one person, Hermann Metzger in Switzerland, Friedrich Mellinger in I believe Berlin, but he had been inactive for years before Germer died. These are just some figures kind of being thrown out that weren't really even involved anymore at this point. But these are kind of details that we can, maybe explore later if we have to. But he dies in 1962, right at the beginning of a very fertile cultural movement in North America and spreading over into other parts of the Western world called the counterculture. And I argue in the thesis that this sort of creates a very fertile environment socially and culturally to sort of initiate a revived interest in some of the sort of alternative spiritual ideas that Crowley was all about. And at the same time, what happens is there's no copyright in North America on Crowley's material. Remember I said that the literary executors were 2 guys from England. So legally standing, they really only had dominion on the English continent at this point. So there was a huge open access period, that I call it, of people, if they were able to gather the material, maybe from earlier sources, books.
At this time, what material would have been out there?
Well,
what could they have gathered?
Not a lot of it, there was a lot of this stuff was in rare book collectors, maybe former still living OTO members, which were few and far between at this point, that might have been holding on to it. Karl Germer, before he died, did manage to get a few publications out there, the Book of Lies. He also, one of the most significant publications at this point was something that hadn't been published in Crowley's day, but were sort of epistle that he wrote to one of his students, Frater Akkad, that later became Liber Aleph. And this was not published until after Crowley's death with Karl Germer, with one of his students by the name of Marcella Ramos Moda. And these were really, other than this and maybe some of the stuff that Regardi was printing about Crowley and maybe about the Golden Dawn, was really what was available. So about 1967 is when you start seeing some people taking this literature and starting to put it out there. There's no copyright constraints in North America, so they're able to do this. And I think maybe Jerry Kay's 1967 Zeno Publishing Book of the Law was one of the things that started going.
That's one of the first ones I can recall. And there was a bootleg version of, I say bootleg now because of course they printed it without copyright, an edition of the Book of Thoth in paperback that was out there. And eventually Magic in Theory and Practice became reprinted. But as you say, the works were few and far between. There was not a large choice of materials. It was very difficult to find Crowley material back then.
Right.
I will know.
Yeah, it seems like what really started initiating North America was, I think around 1969 when Samuel Weiser starts picking up the ticket and
right.
and really starts putting out the Equinox and the Book of Thoth. And,
right.
So by 1969 you start seeing this kind of happen.
And Daniel, this was about the time you were out there looking for
I was in California then.
Thelemic writings.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was in California then, and that's where you mentioned Jerry Kay's publication of the Book of the Law. It was his publication of the Book of the Law. It was the first one I ever owned, and I got it directly from him. After that, very shortly after that, in his bookstore, there was a reprint became available of the Castle edition of Magic in Theory and Practice, and that was great. We had the Book of the Law, Magic in Theory and Practice, and the Book of Thoth for quite some time were the first three things I had, and the only things I had. Mm-hmm. Until, as you mentioned, Weiser began to let go of a lot of this material, and the Equinox was one of the first ones that we all rejoiced over, because this material, what had been like a desert of Crowley material, suddenly became a waterfall, and we were really, really thankful for it.
Right.
But in this Magic in Theory and Practice that was available back then is not what we call the blue brick now.
No.
It was considerably less. It didn't have all those
just only part 3,
editions.
Magic in Theory and Practice.
Yeah.
And eventually Weiser would publish book 4, parts 1 and 2, and so on. And other works began to filter out. But it was just a reprint of Crowley. That version of Magic in Theory and Practice was just a reprint of Crowley's Paris publication of book 4, part 3, all by itself.
Right. And Confessions, I think, by Simmons and Grant, in 1969 started getting things going with Duckworth Publishing. A lot of the stuff was still in England being published.
That was actually the first Crowley book I ever saw. Speaking of the Confessions, and the very first Crowley book I ever read, and followed very shortly by the other books we just mentioned. But I found it in a public library in California as a brand new book, and I believe, as you mentioned, the publication date was 1969, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I think basically after that year, in North America anyway, I think the two most significant publications, publishing houses at this point, which I talk about a lot in the thesis, is 93 Publishing out of Quebec, I believe. Mm-hmm. And they did some very nice limited editions, handmade paper, all kinds of wonderful things. But really the largest publishing house that I attribute to a lot of this, and some very interesting stories start coming out of this, is through Samuel Weiser Publishing in
right.
New York City.
Regardi was associated with Llewellyn,
right,
back then, and
right.
they
Sangrail.
They put a toe in the water back then, but not to the extent that Samuel Weiser did. I think they did. What year was it? They did Magic Without Tears. Might have been 70, I don't know. I'd have to look at the date, but it was early.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Well, there's a particular publication that I would like to introduce from your thesis. Let's see. It made a significant impact from what we talked about. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read a small portion.
Sure.
It's titled Marcelo Ramos Mota and the Commentaries of L. On the 19th of July, 1973, Donald Weiser received an inquiry at his publishing office at 734 Broadway in New York City from a Mr. Marcelo Mota. Mota was writing to see if Samuel Weiser Incorporated would be interested in publishing his latest project, The Commentaries of L, a series of commentaries that Crowley wrote on the Book of the Law, along with Mota's own secondary commentaries. But I'm going to end there. Maybe you could shed some light on that and the impact that this publication had.
Right. So I dedicate almost an entire chapter to this because it seems from my research that this publication really initiated a couple different things that I think were significant in the way events kind of played out.
Okay.
First of all, Mota had been involved with Germer before Germer died. He met him in 1953 and became a student of his. And the two shared a very interesting relationship, but also a very close relationship. And Mota had helped Germer with the aforementioned Liber Aleph in 1962. But what happens is Mota's a very serious, very dedicated student to Thelema. And he just, I guess, feels the need to get this material out there. So he's working on this project, which consists of some commentaries on the Book of the Law by Crowley, and also some of his own secondary insights into it. And
so I just, with the other publications that were out there, as I understand it, they were pretty much republications of Crowley's works without a whole lot of original input from a Thelemite. Is that correct? Is that what was on the market at that time?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
I mean, with the exception of Regardi, who was, it wasn't so much Thelemic as it was just Crowleyana at that point that I would consider.
And he was Golden Dawn.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is like a new voice coming out at this point, you know? And this is right when all this revival is happening. But two significant things happen from this publication, which is why I spend so much time with it. During the operation of this publication, it initiates contact with other people that are interested in this stuff, highly interested in Crowley's material, to sort of come together, and they actually meet, and sort of a little bit of a hub forms out of this publication project. But even after that, after it's published and these ideas are disseminated, it reaches even a greater network of people, and really initiates events in a much different way to how we see it as today. That's affected the way it is today.
It changed everything. It really did. And having lived through it, I can testify to that. Myself and two or three others, we had been in quest for a living member of the AA that traced itself to Crowley. And our quest had been in vain. We could not find anyone. And with the commentaries of L, all of that changed. And for us, it changed everything immediately.
And so this publication seemed to have put some feet on the ground for the movement of Thelema, really brought living people together to begin to, more than just, the few surviving members that were left from Crowley's era, to really hey, let's get this started. Let's get something else rolling after.
Well, for those of us who were deeply interested, as you mentioned, people who were deeply interested in Crowley and Thelema, there were really two really important points that struck us at that time. Number one, irrespective of what the book says, here was a person who traced contact to Crowley himself through Carl Germer to Aleister Crowley, a living representative, in other words, and for us that was hugely important. Number two, we read the manuscript, and the content of the manuscript, well, I mean, to put it in the vernacular, it just blew our mind at the time, because it was a living voice, and it wasn't just regurgitating Crowley, but presenting new ideas that showed that Thelema was a living thing. That was hugely important to us as well.
And you can see through a lot of these letter correspondences between the Samuel Weiser Publishing House and during this whole period. Moda was no lightweight in his idea of how things should be published. He had very serious ideas about how things should be published, how things should be standardized. He often would get copies from other Thelemic stuff that was being produced at this point and just go off on it. I remember one letter where he just is lambasting against I think a copy of Vision in the Voice that might have been published by Regardi, where Regardi has the commentaries of Crowley's, but doesn't differentiate between his own commentaries on the book.
Was that the Sangreal?
I think so, yeah. And Mo's just like, this is not the way this stuff needs to be published, We need standards. We need to set the bar high.
He told me personally, when he first began to see that material, a lot of that material, that he naively assumed that the people who were publishing the material had the right to do so. And as he began to investigate it, and he found out, of course, that they had no right to publish it whatsoever, that's when he went off. And he was as serious as a heart attack, as we say about that. But early on, he thought he just said, I was so naive, I just couldn't imagine anybody publishing this stuff without having the rights to it. But he quickly found out otherwise.
Right. And I mean, this is important even now, today. I mean, if people are publishing Crowley's work, and botching up a part of the Book of the Law, or something like that, or and there's nothing to be held accountable for it. This is why standardization is so necessary.
And why, like you were saying, I mean, Regardi's commentaries on the Vision and the Voice, you could not distinguish his between Crowley's, which is why in the commentaries of L. Marcello Moda, he distinguishes in type style between which commentary is Crowley's and which is his. So when you read it, you have no question about who wrote what.
Right.
And he stayed fast to that, all through that book. And for us, that was a very important thing. Number one, we actually got to see what Crowley had said about some of those things, his commentaries. Highly edited by Moda, at least a large percentage of it was there. And we were also deeply interested in what Moda had to say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the point is that legitimate copyrights to reproducing the literary work is to preserve the purity and integrity of what was originally said.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's what keeps the movement from degenerating into something completely different.
Right.
From what it was when it started.
And, regardless of what ends up happening later on, with all the copyrights and everything that happens, Moda was kind of there sort of keeping a high bar so that this was something that wasn't ignored,
I'd like to say, looking back on it, I'd like to say that his own actions actually made everybody belly up to the bar over that.
Right.
had he not done so, publications would have probably just run amok and people would have done what they wanted to do. But as a result of some of the things he did there, that also changed everything. It made people aware of the importance of copyright as far as being able to preserve the integrity of original publications. Mm-hmm. And just for that alone, I think we owe him a debt of thanks.
I'd like to present one more question to you, Keith.
Sure.
Based on your thesis, what are some of your overall conclusions?
Well, what I found overall,
okay,
for religious movements in contemporary society was the codependence of people on publications, and how we can measure through a history of publication the vitality of a religious or a spiritual movement or a cultural movement for that matter. What I discovered specifically for Thelema is that because there was a lull period, it kind of required a more liberal period of publication just to revive the interest in it on a cultural level. But as these things became of more interest, it also ran the risk of running amok without any form of standardization. Anyone could really produce Crowley's material and not set any standards for how the material was being produced, and anyone could really say anything about it. So what I found was that as things develop, there has to be a period to legitimize through the securing of copyrights and substantiating itself and legitimating itself for the cause, for its cause as a movement, and within the larger sphere of secular society.
A very important conclusion that I've come to from this podcast and our personal discussions is that Thelema has come a long way in a very short period of time, but it also has a long way to go. I would like to hear some of your conclusions, both you, Keith, and Daniel, regarding the movement of Thelema and its forward motion.
From that point?
From the point
of the revitalization by means of publication. From that point?
Yes.
All right. Keith is certainly well armed to break this discussion open, so I'll leave it to him.
Well, I would consider myself very novice still to the movement, but from my understanding of my research and looking at the history and where things have been and where things are going, it's come a long way. It's come a very long way, and I think through the fact that the editorial board on the Equinox has really honed in on setting standards for publication, for setting standardized, everything from standardized fonts to really well-developed, edited footnotes, such as the stuff in Liber ABBA, the big blue brick, as you mentioned earlier. It's producing literature that we're going to show that this is a growing, thriving movement. And we've come a long way in the legal sense, too. I mean, copyrights at this point have been secured through countries other than just North America, all over the world now. And I might hand this over to you, Daniel, and your experience with traveling around and going to lectures and seeing, the numbers just growing in interest.
Oh, yeah, it is. I mean, we're really, really very excited about it because now I can remember when the number of Thelemites that we knew of who were still active, involved, you could count them on one hand, to seeing our movements grow all across the world, and the securing of copyrights has been headed up, and we owe a great vote of thanks to the genius of William Breeze for that, and he has led the way as far as showing us a scholastic way to edit books, and has produced. He set the bar very high, and we're very thankful for that. And those of us who continue to write and continue to publish, our purpose has been to make the work accessible, as you said, but also to make it scholastically sound. Yeah. With proper references, proper footnotes, so that we can, in going forward, as far as the work of the AA is concerned, the aim of religion, but the method of science, and that for us, that's part of it. Is that we want to produce that material in a sound, scholastic way, because we believe that's, number one, the right thing to do, and number two, it will last way beyond our lives if we do that. And I think we're making great progress in that, and hopefully it will continue beyond our lives into the next generations that follow, because we're, as I said, we're very excited about. We're seeing the Thelemic movement. It's no longer a local thing, unless local is defined as global. And we are really, really getting to that point now. I've mentioned before, and I never thought that in my lifetime I would be invited to the land of the rising sun, Japan, to give lectures on Thelema. And that was very exciting, and I saw that as a harbinger of things to come, that there are no borders. It's up to us to produce our work and produce it in a scholarly way, a scientific way, an intelligent way, and also a way that is totally in keeping with the doctrine that we have embraced. And so we're very encouraged, and I think that what we see now is a period of great success before us, and let us continue it.
I agree. Well, that wraps up this podcast. I hope it wasn't too long for our listeners, but I think you'll find it very interesting. Thank you all for joining me. 93.
93.
93. Thank you.
I am mounted on my steed, on a rolling turf overlooking Devonshire. I must be a shrewd man if I am to arrive. I think it's such a madman who will never have a chance to try. I must be a shrewd man, no siren will not be down.